and move on to our next speaker, which is Jen Poliakonis from the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. I talked a little bit about data. She is going to do a great job of helping you understand the problem of gun violence in the state of Kentucky, and then also some of the research behind it that proves the effectiveness of this law. So Jen, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Whitney, for having me today. First, I'm actually going to talk about the why. Why does Kentucky need this law? If you could go back, Whitney. And then I'm going to talk about why it works. Whitney explained the policy of CAR, and we're just going to go into a few of those details. But first, I just want to talk about the fact in 2019, which is the most recent data just released last month from the CDC, there were 682 gun deaths. Of those, 65% or 470 were actually firearm suicides, and 201 or about 31% were firearm homicides. And you can go to the next slide. I will let everyone know that just so you have something to compare this with, if you compare by rate to average out the population in all of the different states, Kentucky actually has the 14th highest rate of gun violence in the country, combined for both suicide and homicide. And you'll see here that of all of the homicides in Kentucky, 80% of them are completed with a firearm. And for all of the suicides in Kentucky in 2019, almost 60% were completed with a firearm. So you can see that a firearm, the reason that this is the focus is because in the United States, it is the most lethal means for homicides and suicide. And what we're really trying to do with CAR is to temporarily prevent access to that most lethal means. And we know by looking at some of the research, next slide, that there is a growing body of research that shows that laws similar to the Crisis, Aversion, and Rights Retention Bill do work. The CAR is based on protection order laws, risk protection order laws across the country. And the reason that they work is because they're actually aimed at those at elevated risk of violence by focusing on the risk factors that put someone most at risk of either harm to selves or harm to others. Next slide. One of the most exciting studies that we have related to risk protection orders is from Dr. Jeff Swanson from Duke University. And he is able to look at the original risk warrant laws that CAR and similar laws were based upon. And the reason that we look at Connecticut and Indiana's laws is because those are the oldest. And so we have the most data for these states. Really, laws that are similar to CAR in other states, while of course CAR is completely customized for Kentucky, are relatively new. And so we're only just starting to ensure that we're getting statewide studies based on those as well. But from looking at Connecticut's risk warrant law from 1999 to 2013, the study found that one suicide was prevented for every 10 to 20 orders. And in Indiana, one suicide was prevented for every 10 orders. So this is a tool that is incredibly successful at preventing firearm suicide. And the reason that this is true is because when they looked at the suicide rates among the respondents, they found in Connecticut that this annual suicide rate is 40 times higher than the general population. And in Indiana, that the suicide rate was 31 times higher. That means we know that the laws similar to CAR are actually aimed at those who are most at risk of harming themselves. And that is incredibly important. This is not aimed at all gun owners. This is aimed with those who are showing the risk factors that they are suffering from a crisis and they need a temporary solution. They need someone to support them. They need that loved one to come and show them that they care and remove temporarily that most lethal means before a tragedy occurs. Next slide, Whitney. And we've also found in some of the newer studies, and this one is really just descriptive as well, the next one that I discuss. This study or examination is out of California, looking at California's risk protection order. And they found that in 21 orders, the respondents showed clear signs that they intended to commit mass violence. But in all of those 21 orders, there were no, once the firearms were temporarily removed, there were no incidents of any type of mass violence or violence. So we know that at least in those 21 incidents, it seemed to prevent the mass shooting. Next slide. So I really thought that this was interesting in terms of helping us see who are the respondents for risk protection orders in other states, and how could CAR potentially be used in Kentucky? And so this is a descriptive study out of Washington State. And between the end of 2016 and May of 2019, there were 238 protection orders. And of those, 67 were harm to self, 86 were harm to others, and 84 were both. So you can see it's pretty even in terms of those who have a protection order issued to help support them in terms of the different types of gun violence that's out there. And to give you another idea, at least in Washington State, most of these orders were petitioned by law enforcement. So it wasn't family members. Some states allow expanded petitioners, but in Washington State, they found that most of the orders were actually petitioned by law enforcement. And in addition to that, while protection orders in CAR is really based on risk factors more so than a mental health diagnosis, because we know that actually only 4% of all interpersonal gun violence is committed by those with severe mental illness. So mental illness is not actually the best risk factor for determining whether someone is going to hurt a loved one or whether they are going to hurt themselves. Typically, it's risk factors to show that they are in a crisis, and they aren't always a mental health crisis. It could be the loss of a job, so financial crisis. It could be the end of a relationship. Oftentimes, violence is really impulsive, and that's why something that is temporary can allow someone to get through that crisis without finding that connection with the most lethal means. And in Washington, 30% of the respondents, the judges found that the risk behaviors that they were exhibiting felt that they should have a mental health evaluation. So 30% of them had a mental health evaluation. And then the authors of the study concluded that protection orders actually helped individuals gain access to the mental health care that they needed. And so different states work differently. There's a variety. CAR is going to be its own unique law. And so once we get it passed, we'll have to make sure we have data collection so we can track its effectiveness as well. But we're seeing really great progress over the country. And this is something, again, aimed at those most at risk. And we know that it's effective. And that is what's most important.
Thank you, Jen. Really appreciate you sharing that this bill that we are championing will work and reduce violence. That is the whole point.